When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, they did not do so on solid ground. They seized power in the midst of an exhausted country, ravaged by war, ravaged by famine, and fractured to the very core of its social fabric. The tsarist state had collapsed, but no structure existed to replace it. Governing was an act of constant improvisation, and surviving was a matter of brute force. The revolution had barely begun. In this third and final episode of Untold History, we travel to the darkest years of the process: the Civil War, the Red Terror, the final fall of the Romanovs, and the birth of the first socialist state in history. The Bolsheviks knew their control was limited. They held only Petrograd, Moscow, and a few Western industrial centers. The rest of the country was in the hands of former czarist officials, regional leaders, Ukrainian nationalists, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and armed peasants. All of them, sometimes allied, sometimes at odds with each other, would group together under the name of the White Army. Their sole common objective: to destroy the new Bolshevik regime. The Russian Civil War formally broke out in 1918, although the violence had begun before. It was not a war of regular fronts, but a chaos of advances and retreats, sabotage, peasant revolts, and clashes between villages. The lines were blurred, loyalties shifted, and the violence was indiscriminate. To confront this threat, Lenin entrusted the defense of the regime to Leon Trotsky, who organized the Red Army from scratch. Trotsky transformed a scattered mass of armed militants and workers into a disciplined and centralized force. He reintroduced military hierarchy, incorporated former czarist officers under strict surveillance, and used political commissars to ensure the ideological loyalty of each unit. He traveled across the country in an armored train, coordinating fronts, haranguing troops, and punishing desertion with death. At the same time, the Bolsheviks created the Chaika, the secret police. Under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Chaika had unlimited powers to detain, interrogate, torture, and execute anyone suspected of counter-revolution. This period would become known as the Red Terror. In just 2 years, more than 140,000 people were executed without trial. Many more died in concentration camps or during forced relocations. The repression made no distinction between armed enemies and civilian opponents. Economically, Lenin imposed so-called war communism. All industries were nationalized. Private trade was abolished. Land property was requisitioned. Armed brigades were sent to confiscate grain from peasants, sparking rural uprisings in several regions, especially Tambov and Ukraine. Agricultural production plummeted. Famine spread to the cities. Between 1920 and 1922, millions died from malnutrition and associated diseases. One of the darkest episodes occurred in July 1918, when the local Soviet of Ekaterinburg executed Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and their 5 children. They did so secretly, without trial, and with brutal violence. The bodies were doused with acid and thrown into an abandoned mine. For decades, the Soviet regime denied responsibility. But the order had been unspoken: to eliminate any living symbol of the old order. The execution of the Romanovs not only closed an era, but also marked the point of no return for the new regime. The Civil War was not a purely internal conflict. Foreign powers also intervened. France, Great Britain, the United States, and Japan sent troops to support the whites and prevent communism from spreading to Europe. In some regions, such as Siberia and the Arctic, the foreign occupation created more chaos than order. Ironically, this intervention allowed the Bolsheviks to present themselves as defenders of Russian sovereignty against Western imperialism. Despite foreign aid, the whites failed. Their weakness wasn't just military. It was political. They never achieved a common program. They were a chaotic coalition of monarchist restorers, constitutional liberals, authoritarian nationalists, and military men with no clear agenda. They offered no credible alternative. And, like the Bolsheviks, they also committed atrocities: anti-Semitic pogroms, mass reprisals, and looting. In many regions, the peasantry preferred the Red Terror to a return to the old order. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had won. But the victory came at a monstrous price. More than 10 million dead from fighting, famine, epidemics, and purges. The economy was in ruins. The cities were empty. The factories were paralyzed. Lenin understood that without immediate change, the regime would collapse under its own weight. That same year, he launched the new economic policy NEP. It was a tactical shift. It allowed for some private property in the countryside, the revival of trade, and the reopening of small businesses. It was a relief for millions of peasants, but a heresy for many communists. The NEP saved the revolution. But it also opened the first internal cracks. In 1922, the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was officially proclaimed. It was an attempt to reorganize the state on new federative and ideological foundations. But in practice, all power remained concentrated in Moscow and in the Communist Party, which had now become the only legal party. Meanwhile, Lenin was rapidly falling ill. After several strokes, he was partially paralyzed and isolated from power. In his last writings, he warned of the danger posed by one of his most silent collaborators, Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary. Lenin accused him of being rude, abusive, and authoritarian. He recommended removing him from power. But his warnings were ignored. After Lenin's death in January 1924, Stalin began his definitive rise. He marginalized Trotsky, manipulated the party's internal mechanisms, and built a machinery of control that would lead him to become the new undisputed leader. The revolution was over. What was emerging was something else, a totalitarian regime based on central planning, systematic repression, and a cult of personality. But the impact of the Russian Revolution was global. It inspired communist movements in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It altered the balance of power in the 20th century. It ignited hopes and fears in equal measure. It was, perhaps, the greatest political upheaval of the modern world.